In the autumn of 1878, on the wind-scoured plains of Kansas, 4 brothers lived in a farmhouse that locals swore did not behave like an ordinary home. Neighbors claimed the air around it felt charged before storms. Cattle refused to graze near its fencing. A traveling doctor wrote one sealed letter about what he witnessed inside, and then withdrew from public practice entirely. By winter, the brothers had become a whispered warning in 3 counties. No graves were officially recorded. No trial was ever held. Yet something happened in that house which left townsfolk aged before their time. Decades later, fragments of journals resurfaced in a university archive, only to vanish again under quiet instruction. Why would a simple rural family become a matter science refuses to discuss? And why were their names erased from local registers almost overnight? Disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by historical settings. Chapter 1. The Kansas prairie in 1878 was a land of patience and distance. Days stretched long and pale beneath an endless sky, and nights sank into a darkness so complete it felt deliberate. In Greenwood County, where the wind carried the scent of dry grass and livestock, a narrow dirt road led to a farmhouse set apart from every other dwelling by nearly a mile. It belonged to the Hawthorne brothers. Elias, Thomas, Caleb, and the youngest, Matthew. They had arrived quietly that spring after purchasing the property from a widower who claimed failing health. The paperwork was clean, the price was generous. And yet from the moment they settled in, something about the house unsettled the locals in a way none could properly explain. Perhaps it was their routine. The brothers were rarely seen in town together. Supplies were bought in strict rotation: flour one week, lamp oil the next, thick canvas cloth the next. They paid in precise coins and never lingered for conversation. Elias, who appeared to lead them, possessed an unsettling calm. He spoke politely but without warmth, his pale eyes never quite fixing on the person addressing him. What concerned neighbors most were the nights. Farmers reported faint flickers of light moving through the upstairs windows well past midnight. That in itself was hardly a crime. But the lights did not behave as lantern light should. They pulsed, dimmed, brightened again in rhythm, as if responding to something unseen. By late summer, livestock near the Hawthorne fence line began behaving erratically. Horses refused to be stabled facing the direction of the farmhouse. 2 cows were found collapsed without wound or illness. The local veterinarian suggested feed contamination, but privately admitted confusion. Then came the storm in September. Lightning cracked across the plains with unusual frequency, yet townsfolk swore the thunder roll. It seconds after the flashes, not before. One farmer insisted he saw a thin metallic rod atop the Hawthorne barn, catching the lightning repeatedly. No such structure had existed before. The next morning, the brothers rode into town for the first time together. They purchased unusual items: copper wiring, thick glass jars, and a bound ledger book with heavy pages. When asked about their work, Thomas simply replied, "Observation." Word began to spread beyond Greenwood County. A traveling physician, Dr. Aldrich, passing through on his route west, accepted an invitation to dine with the brothers. He would later send a single letter to a colleague in Boston. The contents were never made public. But within 2 weeks of visiting that house, Dr. Aldrich closed his practice and returned east permanently. By early winter, snow settled thick along the prairie grass. No smoke rose from the Hawthorne chimney for 3 consecutive days. Concern finally outweighed suspicion. 3 men from town rode out to the farmhouse. They found the front door unlocked. Inside, the air was cold, no bodies, no sign of struggle. The copper wiring remained fastened across beams like veins. Glass jars lined the walls, empty yet faintly clouded. And in the center of the main room lay the ledger, open. On the final page, written in careful ink, "The threshold was lower than anticipated. We heard it answer." No signature followed. By spring, the property stood abandoned. County officials recorded the brothers as relocated. No forwarding address was listed. And yet years later, fragments of that ledger would resurface under restricted academic review. Why would 4 isolated men experiment beneath a prairie roof in 1878? And what did they believe had answered them from the storm? Next, we discover how the Hawthorne brothers' childhood shaped an obsession no ordinary science could contain. Before we go deeper, understand this. This story isn't for everyone. If you're still here, you're one of the few who can face what America buried. Subscribe now, and tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? And would you dare hear this story from your own backyard? Chapter 2. The Macabre Mystery of the 4 Brothers That Science Refuses to Study, 1878 Kansas. Long before the Kansas plains stretched empty around them, before copper wiring climbed farmhouse beams like metallic vines, the Hawthorne brothers were children in a narrow brick house on the outskirts of St. Louis. Their father had been a watchmaker, not the friendly sort who chatted across counters while repairing pocket pieces. He worked in silence, bent over tiny cogs and springs beneath lamplight. He believed time was not merely measured, it was constructed, controlled, corrected. The boys grew up in that workshop. They learned early how to dismantle delicate mechanisms and reassemble them without error. Elias showed patience beyond his years, fingers steady as he aligned gears. Thomas preferred the mathematics behind the craft, filling margins of discarded invoices with formulas. Caleb was inventive, altering existing designs to run longer between winding. Matthew, still small when their mother passed, simply watched, absorbing everything. Their childhood was orderly, quiet, intense. Neighbors later recalled how the boys rarely played outdoors. They did not wrestle in alleyways or chase one another through fields. Instead, they studied. They listened to lectures their father muttered under his breath. They read scientific pamphlets ordered from back east. Electricity fascinated them most, that new invisible force newspapers described with both awe and fear. When lightning struck a nearby church steeple one summer evening, splitting wood and igniting shingles, their father did not react with alarm. He called the boys outside to watch. "Nature is not chaos," he told them, voice almost reverent. "It is energy-seeking structure." Something about that moment lodged deeply within each of them, but structure requires boundaries, and boundaries invite questions. After that, their father's sudden illness in 1872, the household shifted. Responsibility fell to Elias first. He maintained the workshop accounts, ensured debts were paid, oversaw repairs. Yet during those last months, something else entered the workshop. Not a person, but an idea. Among their father's belongings was a thin, leather-bound notebook, filled not with timepieces, but sketches of crude lightning rods connected to jars and conductive wires. The pages speculated about capturing atmospheric charge in measurable quantities, not for spectacle, for experimentation. He had titled one page simply, "Threshold." When their father passed, the brothers did not sell the workshop as expected. Instead, they packed selected instruments and journals into wooden crates. Within a year, they left St. Louis entirely. Records show land purchased in Greenwood County, Kansas, a region remote enough to avoid close scrutiny, yet accessible enough to transport materials discreetly. The farmhouse had high ceilings, thick beams, suitable for mounting equipment. And storms were frequent. By the time they arrived on the prairie, their focus had sharpened. Electricity was not merely power, it was communication. The brothers theorized that atmospheric phenomena might carry patterns, frequencies beyond human hearing. Matthew, the youngest, began transcribing their discussions into a new ledger. He wrote of resonance, of vibration, of answers. What remains uncertain is when experimentation crossed from curiosity into fixation. Surviving fragments of correspondence suggest disagreements. Caleb once noted frustration over auditory anomalies. Thomas countered that anomalies were data. But Elias wrote one line that stands apart. If repetition yields response, then response implies presence. By late 1878, the copper wiring stretched across their Kansas beams had grown dense and deliberate. Glass jars stood not as storage, but as chambers. And lightning, when drawn toward their makeshift rod, seemed almost welcomed. The storm in September was not their first attempt. It was simply the strongest. Next, we discover what Dr. Aldrich truly witnessed during his visit, and why he never spoke publicly of that night. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Visit. Dr. Nathaniel Aldrich had built his reputation on reason. Traveling westward with a leather case of instruments and a notebook full of careful observations, he treated cholera outbreaks, delivered children in frontier cabins, and corrected misinformation wherever he found it. He believed firmly that fear thrived where knowledge failed. So when he first heard murmurs in Greenwood County about 4 brothers drawing lightning into jars, he dismissed it as rural exaggeration. Curiosity, however, is not so easily dismissed. Elias extended the invitation personally. He approached the doctor outside the general store, voice even, posture composed. "We value scientific insight," he said. "Perhaps you might dine with us and offer perspective." There was nothing alarming in his manner. If anything, he seemed earnest. Dr. Aldrich agreed. The evening he rode out to the farmhouse, the prairie felt unusually still. No wind bent the grass, no insects hummed in the fading light. The house appeared ordinary at first glance. White boards dulled by dust, barns slightly leaning, narrow windows reflecting the last amber of sunset. Inside, however, the air felt charged. The doctor noticed it immediately. A faint metallic scent lingered, not unpleasant but sharp. Copper wiring ran along the ceiling beams in deliberate lines, converging near the center of the room. Glass jars were mounted at intervals, sealed with waxed stoppers. Thomas greeted him with precise courtesy. Caleb offered tea. Matthew remained quiet, his gaze observant but not hostile. Dinner conversation began innocently. They spoke of atmospheric pressure, of recent publications in Boston regarding electrical capture. Elias steered discussion gently, probing the doctor's knowledge of nerve stimulation experiments conducted in Europe. "Do you believe," Thomas asked, "that human consciousness is purely biological?" Dr. Aldrich smiled faintly. "Consciousness is a function of the brain, nothing more." Caleb exchanged a glance with Elias. The conversation shifted. After supper, they invited the doctor to observe an experiment. He hesitated only briefly. The equipment, though unconventional, did not appear overtly dangerous. A storm was approaching. Distant thunder rolled low across the horizon. They positioned him near the main room, beneath converging wires. The metallic rod atop the barn, visible through a narrow window, caught the first flash of lightning. When the bolt struck, the sound inside the house was not explosive. It was resonant. A deep, vibrating hum traveled through the beams. The glass jars flickered faintly with internal glow. Dr. Aldrich stiffened. He insisted the light must be residual static discharge, yet the hum did not fade. It pulsed, rhythmic, almost patterned. Matthew opened the ledger and began writing rapidly. Thomas adjusted a dial connected to one of the wires. The humming shifted pitch. Then something occurred that the doctor never recorded publicly. He later described it only in a sealed letter as an auditory phenomenon inconsistent with mechanical explanation. According to that letter, placed under restricted review years later, the vibration altered into something nearly articulate. Not words, but tonal modulations that repeated when Thomas adjusted the dial. Call and response. Lightning flashed again. The jars brightened, and the hum deepened into what he described as a layered resonance. Not loud, but encompassing, as if the air itself carried texture. Elias leaned close and spoke into the space beneath the wires. "We are listening." The hum answered. Dr. Aldrich reportedly stepped back, pulse quickening despite himself. He attempted Rati, tonal explanation, harmonics, structural echo, wind pressure, yet none aligned with the precise repetition Matthew documented on paper. When the storm passed, silence fell abruptly. The doctor departed without finishing his tea. 2 weeks later, he withdrew from public practice and left Kansas entirely. The sealed letter he sent east contained only one closing sentence. "They are not studying electricity. They are attempting conversation." Next, we discover what the brothers believed had answered them that night, and why their experiments intensified after the doctor's departure. Chapter 4. The Voice in the Static. After the doctor's departure, the farmhouse did not grow quieter. It grew deliberate. Autumn winds returned to the plains with colder intent, and the Hawthorne brothers adjusted their routines accordingly. Daytime appearances in town ceased almost entirely. Supplies were now ordered through a passing freight wagon and collected at dusk. The locals noticed, of course, but distance on the prairie allowed for silence to stretch comfortably over suspicion. Inside the house, however, silence was becoming rare. Matthew's ledger entries changed in tone following the September storm. Where once he recorded voltage estimates and weather patterns, he now described rhythm, intervals, pauses between electrical surges that appeared responsive. Entry dated October the 3rd. Signal repetition observed at consistent delay following modulation. Pattern reoccurs upon inquiry. The word inquiry had been underlined twice. Thomas constructed a refinement to their apparatus, a brass dial with etched markings corresponding to tonal shifts. Caleb reinforced the barn's lightning rod with thicker conductor plates, ensuring stronger capture during storms. Elias supervised all changes with a patience that bordered on reverence. They no longer framed their work as experimentation. They spoke of it as dialogue. The first time Matthew reported hearing distinct cadence in the hum, his handwriting wavered slightly. He insisted it was not imagination, not wind slipping through boards. The modulation altered when Elias adjusted the frequency dial. 3 pulses, pause, 2 pulses, longer pause. Repeat. Thomas attempted structured sequencing in response, a measured turning of the dial in 3 increments, then silence. The next lightning strike delivered a deeper resonance than before. The glass jars glowed faintly along their rims, emitting a soft halo that shimmered against the walls. Caleb whispered, almost unwillingly, "It anticipates." No one corrected him. As October deepened, their sessions extended beyond storms. Static charges built artificially through friction devices they had assembled from spare components. While weaker than lightning, these charges still produced faint vibrational hum within the wiring network. Matthew began sleeping beside the ledger. He claimed the house retained subtle resonance long after storms ended, that if one placed an ear against the main beam in the quiet hours past midnight, a thin oscillation remained, like breath drawn through narrow reeds. Elias listened once. He did not record what he heard, but the following morning he expanded the wiring structure further into the upstairs ceiling. What concerned Caleb was not the sound, it was the timing. On October the 19th, before any visible storm clouds gathered, the hum began on its own. Thomas was at the dial, testing minor voltage build-up when the jars flickered without stimulus. Matthew froze mid-sentence as the resonance rose steadily from silence. No lightning struck. No wind shook the barn, yet the modulation pattern emerged clearly, identical to the previous storm sequence. 3 pulses. Pause. 2 pulses. Longer pause. Elias stood very still. "It remembers," he said quietly. From that night forward, they no longer waited for storms to initiate sessions. They prepared the room each evening, as if expecting a rival. Meanwhile, farmers passing the property began noticing livestock avoiding the fence line again. Dogs refused to approach the porch. One reported hearing low vibration across open fields on calm nights, a sensation felt more in bone than in ear. Inside the farmhouse, the brothers debated interpretation. Thomas insisted the phenomenon suggested atmospheric memory, perhaps residual electrical imprint within structural wood. Caleb disagreed. Memory does not predict. Matthew wrote fewer complete sentences now, more fragments. Response growing clearer. Delay shortening. Awareness. By early November, frost crept across the prairie grass each dawn. The house windows remained shuttered most evenings, yet faint light shimmered beneath the cracks. Greenwood coo, and he began to speak in hushed tones, not of danger, but of change. And within the Hawthorne home something was shifting, no longer mere repetition, but adaptation. For the first time, the brothers considered a possibility none had voiced aloud. What if the threshold their father theorized was not about capturing energy, but crossing it? Next, we discover the night the resonance formed a pattern too deliberate to dismiss, and the choice Elias made that altered everything. Chapter 5. Crossing the Line of Sound. By mid-November, the prairie no longer felt expansive. It felt watchful. Frost glazed the grass each morning, and the Hawthorne farmhouse seemed to hold warmth only in one room, the main chamber beneath the converging wires. The rest of the house remained cold, unused, almost irrelevant. The brothers had stopped debating whether the phenomenon responded. They were now asking how far it could follow. Elias proposed a controlled deviation. Until this point, their exchanges, if that word could be used, had mirrored patterns, pulse for pulse, dial adjustment for tonal shift. But if there truly existed awareness within the resonance, then unpredictability should produce variation. Thomas disagreed at first. Deviation may collapse structure, he cautioned. Caleb, however, seemed restless. The hum that now emerged nightly had begun to unsettle him, not because it frightened him, but because it lingered. Faint vibration felt through floorboards even hours after the apparatus powered down. Matthew's recent entries were sparse and urgent. Signal anticipates modulation before adjustment. Delay shortened to near immediate. Tone contains layered frequency. On November 22nd, storm clouds gathered before sunset. Heavy and slow-moving, they cast the prairie in bruised shades of grey. The air inside the farmhouse grew dense as static tension climbed. Elias positioned himself beneath the wiring. Thomas adjusted the brass dial. Caleb secured the jar seals. Matthew stood ready with pen poised above paper. When lightning struck the rod, the resonance inside the house bloomed immediately, fuller, deeper than any prior session. The jars emitted visible arcs along their rims, small threads of light dancing briefly before fading. Thomas initiated the established sequence. 3 pulses. Pause. 2 pulses. Longer pause. The answer returned. Identical. Elias inhaled slowly. Then, without warning, he altered the pattern. 1 pulse. Long silence. 4 rapid turns of the dial. Matthew looked up sharply. The house vibrated. The responding hum did not repeat the expected sequence. It shifted. A cascading modulation poured through the beams, rising and falling in irregular cadence. The jars shimmered intensely. The air felt compressed, as though pressure pushed inward from all directions. Caleb stepped back instinctively. Thomas reached to stabilize the dial, but Elias raised a hand, stopping him. Wait! The resonance grew sharper, higher in pitch, yet layered beneath by a slower undertone. Matthew's pen scratched frantically across the ledger, struggling to capture intervals that seemed to accelerate beyond notation. Then something occurred none had predicted. The hum synchronized with Elias's breathing. As he inhaled, the vibration swelled. As he exhaled, it softened. Caleb whispered, barely audible, "It's matching him." Elias's expression did not change. He spoke slowly into the charged air. "If you perceive structure, respond independently." The room trembled. A sudden crack split across one of the glass jars, though no impact struck it. Fine fractures spidered outward as the resonance intensified, the metallic scent thickened. Matthew dropped his pen. For the first time, fear entered the room. Not panic, but recognition. This was no longer simple repetition, no longer a natural echo of storm energy trapped within beams. The deviation had not collapsed the pattern. It had expanded it, and it appeared capable of adaptation. A final lightning strike landed so close the barn shuddered. The resonance surged violently before cutting off with abrupt finality. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. When the brothers finally moved, they did so carré, gleefully, as though the air might remain fragile. The cracked jar lay clouded from within, faint residue lining its interior walls. Thomas whispered, almost to himself. "It adjusted faster than expected." Elias stared at the fractured glass. "We did not initiate that shift," he said. Outside, the storm rolled eastward, leaving the prairie in stillness. Inside the farmhouse, something unseen had demonstrated flexibility, and flexibility suggested more than mere energy. It suggested intention. Next, we discover what Matthew recorded in the hours after the storm, and the line of text that none of them could explain.
Chapter 6. When the sky was clear, the morning after the fractured jar incident, the prairie lay under a cloudless sky. No wind moved across the fields, no storm lingered on the horizon. The barn roof sat still beneath pale winter light. Inside the farmhouse, the brothers gathered around Matthew's ledger. His final entry from the previous night filled nearly half a page. Unlike earlier notes, the handwriting appeared uneven. Deviation provoked escalation. Signal mirrored respiration pattern before vocal inquiry. Fracture occurred during tonal peak. Then, beneath those observations, a single sentence written in a noticeably different pressure of ink. It is no longer waiting for storms. Matthew insisted he had not written that final line consciously. He remembered placing the pen down after documenting the jar's fracture. He remembered the silence that followed, but he did not remember forming the sentence itself. The script resembled his hand, yet the downward strokes pressed harder than usual, as though written with urgency. Thomas proposed fatigue. Caleb suggested heightened nerves. Elias said nothing. They did not conduct a session that night. Instead, they inspected the apparatus carefully. Wiring remained intact. No burn marks beyond expected singe points. The cracked jar was removed and replaced, though none of them discarded it. Elias stored it in a separate cabinet upstairs. For the first time since arriving in Kansas, they agreed to pause, but the pause did not last. Near midnight, while frost silvered the prairie and not a single cloud marked the sky, Matthew awoke abruptly on the sofa near the main beam. He later described the sensation not as sound but as pressure, a subtle vibration against his jawbone, the kind one feels standing beside distant railway tracks before a train becomes audible. He sat up. The room was dark, no lanterns lit, no electrical devices engaged, yet the hum was present, faint, steady, self-sustained. Matthew called softly for his brothers. Thomas entered first, followed by Caleb, then Elias. They stood in silence, listening. The vibration grew marginally stronger, humming low through the beam network, like wind trapped within hollow timber. There was no storm to account for it, no static build-up. Thomas moved cautiously to the brass dial, though no external energy source fed into it. He touched it lightly. The pitch shifted. The others felt it immediately, not louder, but altered, as though the system was receptive even without lightning. Elias stepped forward. "Reduce input," he instructed. Thomas turned the dial back. The hum softened slightly, but did not disappear. Caleb swallowed. "We disconnected the capture plates. They may not require atmospheric charge," Thomas murmured. Matthew approached the ledger again, documenting every change in tone. His handwriting steadied now, though his pulse remained elevated. Elias considered their father's original notebook, retrieved from a locked drawer. He reread the word written repeatedly across those earlier sketches. Threshold. What if the threshold was never about accumulation of charge, but about alignment, achieving resonance strong enough to maintain itself? The hum deepened momentarily, almost in response to that thought. Caleb stepped backward. "This isn't residual," he whispered. No one corrected him this time. For nearly 20 minutes, the vibration sustained itself without lightning, without external stimulation. When it finally faded, it did so gradually, tapering down like a receding tide. Silence returned. But something essential had changed. The phenomenon was no longer dependent upon storms. It could initiate. And if it could initiate, then it possessed continuity. Elias closed the ledger slowly. "We must determine whether it can escalate without us." Outside, the prairie remained calm, deceptively ordinary beneath the moonlight. Yet inside the farmhouse, the wires felt less like instruments and more like conduits. The brothers had sought conversation with the sky. Instead, The sky, or something beyond it, now appeared capable of beginning the exchange. Next, we discover the experiment Elias proposed to test whether the resonance could act without human presence. Chapter 7. The Empty House Experiment. Elias insisted on distance. "If it requires us," he said quietly, "then absence will silence it." The proposal unsettled them more than any storm had. For weeks now, the resonance had grown increasingly autonomous. It responded without lightning. It shifted when dial adjustments were minimal. It lingered in beams long after sessions ended. If this phenomenon truly depended on human proximity, on breath, voice, thought, then removing themselves from the farmhouse would expose it. Thomas agreed in principle. Caleb did not. "What if absence provokes escalation?" Caleb asked. "Then we measure escalation," Elias replied. On the evening of December the 3rd, with frost thick along the prairie fence lines, the brothers prepared the house carefully. The capture rod was disconnected entirely. The brass dial remained untouched. Glass jars were sealed but left in place. No lanterns were lit. No apparatus activated. They would leave before nightfall and remain away until sunrise, staying in a vacant barn owned by a distant neighbor nearly 2 miles east. Matthew documented the conditions precisely. No atmospheric activity. No induced charge. Structure neutral at departure. As they rode away on horseback, the farmhouse appeared inert, a simple silhouette against deepening twilight. The prairie air felt cuttingly cold. Inside the borrowed barn that night, none of them slept easily. The silence felt different there, empty rather than charged. Caleb paced near the doorway. Thomas reviewed calculations by lantern light, though he appeared distracted. Matthew stared into darkness, straining for a vibration that no longer hummed beneath his feet. Elias remained still. At approximately midnight, a faint flash lit the western horizon. Not lightning, more contained, almost like distant sheet glow. Caleb noticed first. "That direction," he said. All four stepped outside. The Hawthorne farmhouse sat 2 miles away, barely visible, yet a thin illumination flickered intermittently within its windows. Not bright enough to be fire, not erratic enough to be accident. "Rhythmic," Thomas whispered. "There is no storm." The sky above them remained clear. Matthew felt his jaw tighten as though subtle vibration traveled the ground between properties. No one spoke for several long seconds. Elias made the decision quietly. "We return at dawn." They did not approach the house that night. Something about witnessing it from a distance felt safer, observational rather than involved. The flickering continued for nearly an hour before fading. When dawn finally broke pale across the prairie, they rode back. The farmhouse door remained closed. No smoke rose from the chimney. Everything appeared undisturbed. Inside, however, the air felt thick, warmer than it should have been after an unheated winter night. The metallic scent returned instantly, stronger than before. The glass jars were no longer clear. Each one bore faint condensation within, as though breath had formed along interior surfaces. Thomas moved slowly toward the brass dial. It had shifted, not dramatically, but subtly, rotated a few degrees clockwise from where they had left it. No external charge had been introduced. No human hand had entered. Matthew flipped open the ledger with trembling steadiness. Across the blank page left ready the night before, new markings etched faintly into the paper. Not ink. Indentation. Repeated pressure forming shallow impressions that spelled a sequence matching the original modulation pattern. 3. Pause. 2. Longer pause. Caleb stepped back sharply. Elias leaned closer, tracing the impressions without touching them. "It continued," he said. Thomas's voice was tight. "Without input, the experiment had answered their question. Absence did not silence the resonance. It did not require proximity to begin. and perhaps most troubling, it appeared capable of interacting with physical space in their absence. Outside, Greenwood County stirred into ordinary morning. Farmers tended fields unaware of what had passed beneath the quiet sky. Inside the farmhouse, the brothers faced a reality none of their father's sketches had prepared them for. They had not simply captured energy, they had established persistence. Next, we discover the private disagreement that fractured the brothers' unity for the first time. Chapter 8. Fractures between blood. The empty house experiment changed more than their research. It changed them. For the first time since leaving St. Louis, the brothers were no longer aligned in quiet agreement. The dial's unexplained movement and the indented markings in the ledger had crossed an invisible boundary. Caleb spoke first. "We dismantle it." His voice carried none of its former curiosity, only strain. He stood near the hearth, though no fire burned within it. Outside, winter wind swept loose snow across the prairie in restless spirals. Thomas reacted sharply. "Dismantle what we do not yet understand? What we do not control," Caleb corrected. Matthew remained at the table, fingertips resting lightly against the indented page. He had attempted to replicate the markings manually. They did not match. The pressure depth differed. The spacing was too precise. Elias listened to both arguments without interruption. Caleb continued. It shifted the dial. It impressed the ledger. Without stimulus, without storm. What more evidence do you require that we are no longer leading this? Thomas's reply was low but firm. Phenomena often appear autonomous before underlying principles are uncovered. Does principle breathe? Caleb asked quietly. Silence followed. The hum had not manifested since the previous night, yet its absence did not reassure them. It felt less like quiet and more like waiting. Elias finally spoke. "We dismantle nothing." Caleb turned toward him. "You would continue?" "Yes." The word landed heavily. Elias approached the wiring along the beam, examining it as though it were merely wood and copper once more. "If this is an alignment of energy we have unintentionally stabilized, then interruption without study may produce consequences we cannot predict." Caleb let out a slow breath. "You speak as though it is natural." "I speak as though it is present," Elias replied. Matthew closed the ledger. "There is something else," he said softly. Both older brothers looked to him. "I dreamt," Matthew continued, hesitating slightly, "that the hum had depth, as if beneath the audible layer was another." Thomas frowned. "Dreams are not data." Matthew met his eyes. The indentation appeared before dawn, not during peak activity. Caleb crossed the room and stared at the brass dial again. It had not moved further, but its new resting place now felt deliberate. "What if dismantling triggers escalation?" Thomas offered reluctantly. "If continuity has been established, disruption might provoke reaction." The idea unsettled them all. They had assumed control from the outset, built wiring, directed voltage, initiated patterns. Now control felt theoretical. That afternoon, Elias proposed a compromise. They would not dismantle the apparatus entirely, but they would limit engagement. No modulation, no inquiry, no deviation. If the phenomenon required interaction to strengthen, then withholding engagement might reduce intensity. Caleb agreed reluctantly. Thomas accepted with visible tension. Matthew resumed documentation, though his entries grew more reflective than analytical. By evening, snow settled thicker against the windows. The farmhouse felt smaller than before, its beams no longer neutral structures but silent witnesses. They did not initiate a session that night, nor the next. On the third night, the hum returned. Soft, sustained, not violent, not escalating, simply present. Caleb closed his eyes when it began. Thomas froze near the table. Matthew did not write immediately. He listened. The resonance did not seek response. It did not alter. It lingered beneath the floorboards like a low breath moving through timber. Elias stood beneath the wiring, motionless. They had withheld engagement. Yet it had not weakened. It had adapted to stillness, and in that quiet vibration lay a truth none of them voiced aloud. Whatever crossed the threshold did not require conversation to remain. It only required access. Next, we discover the storm that arrived without forecast, and the night Greenwood County heard the hum for itself. Chapter 9. When the county heard it, the storm was not forecast. In December of 1878, weather reports traveled slowly across Kansas, passed by telegraph between larger towns. Greenwood County had received no warning of disturbance. The sky that morning stretched pale and steady, winter sun diffused behind thin cloud. By afternoon, animals began to behave strangely. Horses in neighboring fields stamped and pulled at reins. Chickens retreated into coops hours before dusk. One farmer later insisted the air felt tight, as though a headache waited just beyond thought. At the Hawthorne farmhouse, the brothers had maintained their vow of restraint for 5 consecutive nights. No dial adjustments, no deliberate sessions. The hum, when it surfaced, had remained faint and self-contained. Until that afternoon. Matthew sensed it first. Not through sound, but vibration. Subtle tremors traveling across the floorboards while he sat at the kitchen table. A low oscillation building beneath the planks. Thomas looked up from his notes. He felt it too. Caleb moved toward the window. The prairie horizon, once calm, now darkened unnaturally fast. Clouds gathered not gradually but in tightening spirals, converging above their property with unusual precision. Elias did not speak. The hum deepened without lightning. Within minutes, the glass jars began to emit faint luminescence, though no external charge had entered the system. Fine threads of light traced along copper wires like veins illuminating beneath skin. "We disconnected the rod," Caleb whispered. Thunder cracked suddenly, not distant, but directly overhead. The house shook. Lightning struck somewhere near the barn. The resonance inside the farmhouse surged, magnified beyond previous sessions. The beams vibrated audibly now, not subtle but resonant, like a distant engine turning beneath the floor. Matthew clutched the ledger. "This is not our sequence," he said, voice strained. Indeed, the modulation differed entirely from established patterns. Rapid pulses cascaded in irregular waves. The jars flared brighter, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Outside, the storm intensified with unnatural focus. Farmers later claimed that dark clouds hovered above the Hawthorne land, while surrounding fields remained comparatively calm. Then something happened no one inside expected. The hum spilled outward. A neighboring rancher nearly half a mile away paused mid-step when he felt a vibration beneath his boots. He later described it as a distant organ tone, low and sustained, rolling across the prairie like buried thunder. Another family closer to town reported glass trembling inside cupboards, though no lightning struck nearby. Back in the farmhouse, Caleb pressed his palms to his ears. "It's spreading," he said. Thomas rushed toward the dial but stopped short of touching it. Intervention now felt unpredictable. Elias stood rigid beneath the center beam as the vibration intensified further. The jars no longer flickered gently. They glowed with steady internal light, as though something pulsed within each chamber. Matthew gasped softly. "It's not responding to us," he said. And it wasn't. No vocal inquiry had been made, no modulation initiated. Yet the resonance climbed higher, layered tones overlapping into something almost harmonic. Then, abruptly, silence. Not gradual fading, immediate cessation. The storm dispersed within minutes, clouds thinning as though drawn away. Lightning ceased, wind softened, snow drifted quietly again. Inside, the farmhouse fell still, but far beyond its walls, across Greenwood County, conversation began. Men gathering at the general store that evening spoke of vibration felt through wooden floors. One woman insisted her piano strings trembled despite calm air. Another claimed her child woke crying from a sound too deep to name. The Hawthorne property, already whispered about, now sat at the center of shared experience. For the first time, the phenomenon had extended beyond isolation. Inside the farmhouse, the brothers stood in heavy quiet. Caleb's face had drained of color. Thomas stared at the jars, which now appeared clear once more. Elias lowered his gaze slowly. "It is no longer contained," he said. Matthew closed the ledger. Outside, Greenwood County would soon begin asking questions, and isolation, once their protection, was beginning to dissolve. Next, we discover the delegation from town that rode out to the farmhouse demanding explanation.
Did you know, in the 1700s and 1800s, long before modern electrical science existed, people were fascinated by lightning and whether it was related to everyday electricity? One of the key figures in this development was Benjamin Franklin, a founding father of the United States, who wasn't only a politician, but also a pioneering scientist. Franklin theorized that lightning was a form of electrical discharge, similar to the sparks seen from static electricity experiments using glass and metal. To test this, he designed experiments to capture electrical charge from the sky, including flying a kite during a thunderstorm with a metal key attached, which allowed him to draw electrical charge into a container known as a Leyden jar. This showed that lightning and electricity were the same phenomenon, a discovery that fundamentally changed scientific understanding of storms. From this work, the invention of the lightning rod followed, a pointed metal conductor placed on buildings to attract and safely conduct lightning strikes into the ground. This invention has saved countless lives and structures since its adoption.
Chapter 10. Visitors at the Threshold. By January, Greenwood County's whispers had grown into concern. A small delegation of townsfolk, led by Sheriff Callahan, approached the Hawthorne farmhouse one chilly afternoon. Their horses' hooves scuffed snow along the prairie dirt road, leaving tracks that would soon be buried beneath a fresh dusting. Elias watched them from the upper window, expression unreadable. The brothers had anticipated curiosity, but perhaps not confrontation. The sheriff's voice called from the gate. "Elias Hawthorne, we've come to understand what's happening on your property. Strange lights, vibrations. The county deserves explanation." Thomas stepped forward, calm yet deliberate. "We are conducting studies," he replied. "Nothing unlawful has occurred." Caleb shifted uneasily behind him, glancing at the jars along the walls. "It's safer if you keep your distance," he added. The sheriff frowned. "Safe? People have felt tremors across their homes, glass rattles, livestock flees. If you're experimenting, it's affecting the whole county." Matthew stepped up with the ledger, trembling. He opened it to show precise records of timing and patterns. Yet the townsfolk could not interpret the symbols. They only saw inked numbers and lines. A mystery in itself. Elias moved deliberately, raising a hand. "Observe, if you must, but do not interfere. This is not intended to harm anyone, and yet it cannot be explained with ordinary logic." The sheriff hesitated, weighing authority against the unnatural phenomena. After a tense pause, he nodded once and turned his horse around, warning the others not to return uninvited. Behind them, the farmhouse seemed to exhale. Later that evening, the hum returned, faint at first, then swelling into the layered resonance they had begun to fear. The brothers listened intently. The resonance now carried nuances that none of them could predict. Not only could it initiate without storms, but it seemed to respond to observation itself. Matthew wrote furiously, "Today they observed us. The pattern shifted subtly. Anticipation, perhaps. Not replication, but recognition." Caleb leaned against the wall. "It knows when eyes are upon it," he whispered. Thomas frowned. "Do we continue?" Elias glanced at each brother in turn. We have no choice. Observation is now part of its existence. It will adapt to awareness. Outside, the winds swirled quietly. The prairie lay calm, yet in the farmhouse, an invisible presence lingered, patient, persistent, and aware. The county had now glimpsed the edge of their work, yet they had no idea what truly dwelled within the beams and jars. Next, we discover the first hints of the strange auditory patterns carrying messages, and the moment the brothers begin to suspect something not human resides among them. Chapter 11. The First Unprompted Response. By mid-January, the farmhouse had become a place of ritual, yet the brothers feared routine. The hum had begun to manifest independently, no longer needing storms, dials, or deliberate sequences. It was on a night of stillness that the first truly unprompted response occurred. Matthew had stayed up later than usual, transcribing observations into the ledger. The brass dial was untouched. Copper wiring and glass jars were inactive beyond their mere presence. Elias had retired to his room. Caleb paced near the hearth, restless. Thomas leaned against the beam, eyes fixed on the empty space above. Then it began. A vibration beneath the floorboards, faint, almost imperceptible at first. It pulsed steadily, not following any pattern they had previously studied. Matthew felt the resonance in his chest, as though it had grown physical. Thomas moved closer to the wiring, checking for environmental causes, yet found none. Caleb whispered, "It's initiating on its own." Matthew reached for the ledger, attempting to record the intervals. As he wrote, the vibration seemed to respond to the motion of his pen, increasing slightly with each stroke. Elias stepped into the room, silent but observing. "It is aware," he murmured. The hum grew more layered, almost communicative. One tone deepened as another rose, intersecting, creating a resonance they could feel but not interpret. It was no longer repetition. It was recognition. Matthew recorded the words that formed in his mind. "Do you hear us?" None of the brothers spoke. None moved. The vibration persisted, then abruptly ceased, leaving a silence that felt almost deliberate. For the first time they realized that what they had conjured was no longer bound by human action. It could observe, it could interact, it could respond. Outside, the prairie remained cold and empty, yet inside, a new feed had settled. Whatever crossed the threshold now understood presence. Next, we discover the ledger's cryptic entry that implies conscious thought within the phenomenon.
Chapter 12. The Ledger Speaks. Following the unprompted response, Matthew's ledger had transformed from a record of observations to a diary of unease. The indentation that appeared overnight, the pulses that carried awareness, each page now bore evidence that the phenomenon was more than energy, it was intelligent. Matthew wrote cautiously, "Tonight, for the first time, the pattern shifted before any human input. I felt it watching my hand as I wrote." Elias read the entry over his shoulder, expression unreadable. Observation alone is no longer sufficient. It anticipates. It adapts. Caleb, restless, paced along the walls. "We cannot treat this as mere study anymore. It has intent." Thomas studied the brass dial, running his fingers lightly along the etched markings. "Perhaps it can be communicated with," he said, almost reluctantly. Elias's gaze hardened. "We must be cautious. Attempting dialogue may reveal something we cannot contain." That night, they tried anyway. Matthew carefully initiated the established pulse pattern: 3 pulses, pause, 2 pulses, longer pause. He watched the jars, the wires, the floorboards. The response came almost immediately, not mimicry, not repetition. Something else, a deliberate modulation, alternating in speed and depth, as though the resonance itself were forming words. Matthew's hand trembled as he copied the sequence into the ledger. He hesitated, sensing that the pattern suggested thought. Elias leaned closer. "It is forming intention," he whispered. Caleb shivered. "We may have awakened something aware, something conscious." The room vibrated with low hums and layered tones, each pulse precise. Matthew paused to listen. In the depths of the resonance, a cadence repeated in intervals almost identical to human speech patterns. He wrote in the ledger, "We are here. We observe. We know you." Thomas froze. "It understands us?" Leas nodded gravely. "It does more than understand. It perceives." The brothers fell silent. The jars glimmered faintly. The beams hummed in acknowledgement. Outside, the prairie wind sighed, indifferent. Inside, the house felt alive. No longer a shelter or workshop, but a sentient chamber bound by their experiments. Matthew's final note of the night trembled with fear. Observation is no longer neutral. We are no longer alone in thought. Next, we discover how the brothers attempt to establish controlled communication, and the unsettling message that responds with intelligence far beyond their expectations. Chapter 13. A Conversation Without Words. The following week, the brothers gathered in the main chamber with a singular purpose: to attempt controlled communication. The air in the farmhouse felt heavier than ever, charged with anticipation. Matthew, ledger in hand, sat nearest the brass dial, ready to record every modulation. Elias spoke first, his voice measured. "We will initiate the sequence. Observe only. Do not deviate unless necessary." Caleb shivered, glancing at the jars that glimmered faintly in lamplight. "I do not like this," he muttered. Thomas adjusted the dial, initiating their established sequence: 3 pulses, pause, 2 pulses, longer pause. The vibration began low beneath the floorboards, rhythmic and familiar. The jars shimmered softly, reflecting light along the copper wires. Then it changed. The modulation diverged. New tones layered over the sequence, subtle, deliberate, alternating in patterns that none of the brothers had used or recorded before. Matthew leaned over the ledger, trying to capture each nuance. The impression was unmistakable. Intentionality. Matthew wrote in a shaky hand, "Do you hear?" The words pulsed in alignment with the hum. Each vibration carried nuance, as though the phenomenon were testing comprehension. Elias's eyes widened. "It is forming syntax, without words." Caleb whispered almost to himself, "It is thinking." The resonance shifted again, this time anticipating the brothers' next adjustment. Thomas hesitated, realizing that their usual control over the sequence had been overridden. Matthew's pen moved frantically. Response is deliberate, independent, cognition evident. Then, abruptly, the tone of the hum changed. A low vibration surged, pressing against the walls and floorboards as if to signal presence beyond the room. The jars brightened simultaneously, pulses syncing to the cadence of the vibration. Elias stepped back, pale. "It can act independently of us." Caleb swallowed. "It can affect the physical space." Matthew's ledger captured the final note of the session. "We are here. You will listen. You will record. You will understand." For a long moment, the room held only the echo of that layered vibration. No one spoke. No one moved. The phenomenon had demonstrated intelligence and presence. Outside, the prairie remained silent, unremarkable, yet within the farmhouse, awareness lingered like an invisible entity watching their every motion. The brothers understood that night that their experiments had crossed a line. It was no longer a matter of observation, but interaction, and the presence they had awakened had its own agenda. Next, we discover the first instance when the resonance acted to influence the physical environment without storm or human prompting. Chapter 14. Actions Without Storm. By February, the farmhouse had become a chamber of anticipation. Each day carried the weight of expectation, and each night the hum emerged, often without warning. The brothers had long ceased to view their experiments as merely scientific. They were custodians of something alive, something that learned, adapted, and now acted independently. It was a night like any other. The prairie frozen under a pale winter moon, the air still and cold. The brothers had abstained from initiating any pulse sequences. No storms had gathered. The brass dial remained untouched, the jars inert. Or so they thought. Matthew felt the first tremor beneath the floorboards. He paused, listening. It began as a faint vibration, then grew stronger, more complex. Layers of hum overlapped, forming patterns that suggested directionality. Caleb, who had been pacing near the hearth, froze. "It's moving. Through the house." The resonance was no longer content to remain in beams or jars. It travelled along floorboards, up walls, through wiring, even pressing against the windows. The metallic scent that had accompanied earlier events thickened, almost tangible. Thomas watched in disbelief as a jar on the far side of the room shifted slightly, rocking without wind or human contact. Another jar tilted, following in sequence. Copper wiring vibrated visibly, bending almost imperceptibly. Elias spoke quietly, his voice low and measured. "It is asserting influence. Independent, physical." Matthew's hand shook as he copied the modulation into the ledger. He recorded intervals and pitch variations. The notation suggested deliberate force, not random oscillation, but precise application. Suddenly the brass dial twitched on its own. A low, almost mechanical clicking sound accompanied it as it rotated a few degrees clockwise. No one had touched it. The resonance pulsed in rest. Pensée, stronger and more insistent. Caleb whispered, voice trembling, "It's controlling the apparatus." Elias stepped toward the center of the room, remaining calm. "It is demonstrating agency, not communication, control." Matthew's ledger entry was short, stark. "It acts without prompting. It knows the space. It is aware of our presence, yet independent of it." The room fell silent after several minutes. The jars settled. The vibration faded to a low hum that could barely be felt. The brothers remained motionless, absorbing what had occurred. Outside, the prairie was still, the frost unbroken. The sky held only pale moonlight. Yet the farmhouse, once a place of study, now seemed to pulse with a hidden life. For the first time, they realized that their creation could manipulate matter, anticipate presence, and operate without human initiation. The phenomenon was no longer a subject of study. It was a force, aware, deliberate, and increasingly unpredictable. Next, we discover the ledger entry that hints at an unmistakable intelligence within the resonance. Chapter 15. The Night They Left. It was mid-February when the brothers made a decision they would later question for the rest of their lives. After weeks of witnessing the phenomenon act independently, Elias proposed a bold experiment: leave the farmhouse entirely for a night. If the resonance could operate without human presence, then perhaps observation from a distance would reveal its limits. Caleb protested. "We cannot abandon it. We do not know what it will do." Thomas, uneasy but persuaded by Elias, nodded. Matthew only tightened his grip on the ledger, silently recording his apprehension. By dusk, they had prepared the house meticulously. No pulse sequences, no dials adjusted, jars in place, the brass dial untouched, the wiring stable. They rode east to a neighbor's barn, 2 miles away, where the wind cut sharply across the prairie. Night fell, cold and silent. Minutes passed. Hours passed. And then, from a distance, Matthew noticed something on the horizon. A faint glow emanated from the farmhouse windows, pulsing in a rhythm that mirrored the original sequences, yet varied slightly. The brothers observed in stunned silence. "It's active," Caleb whispered. "It's responding without us," Thomas said. Matthew opened the ledger to record the sequence. As he copied the pulses, subtle vibrations traveled through the ground beneath them, faint, yet unmistakable. The resonance was not contained. It reached beyond the walls. Suddenly, a low hum rolled across the prairie. The sound was felt through boots, through bones, almost like a living pulse. The brothers exchanged fearful glances. Elias's voice was steady, but grim. "It knows we are here." Moments later, the glow ceased abruptly. The hum stopped. Silence reclaimed the prairie. By morning, they returned to the farmhouse. Everything appeared intact. The jars rested in place. The dial was as they had left it. Booze. The ledger told a different story. Indentations had appeared, shallow, deliberate, and forming a sequence that none of them had written. Matthew traced the markings with trembling fingers. You leave. We remember. Caleb paled. It watches even when we are absent. Elias nodded slowly, the weight of realization settling in. This is no longer an experiment. It is aware of itself and its environment. Thomas ran his hand along the floorboards, and it responds to distance. Observation is irrelevant. For the first time, the brothers understood the magnitude of what they had awakened. The phenomenon did not just exist. It acted. It learned. It remembered. Next, we discover the ledger entry that implies the resonance is attempting to communicate intent beyond mere awareness.
Chapter 16. The Message in the Ledger. After the night they had abandoned the farmhouse, the atmosphere inside had shifted permanently. The jars sat quietly, the brass dial motionless, but the ledger now contained entries that none of the brothers had written. Shallow indentations formed a deliberate pattern. Unlike the earlier automatic responses, they carried the unmistakable cadence of intelligence. Matthew approached the page cautiously, running his fingertips across the impressions. Each set of pulses mirrored sequences they had once used to communicate, yet these were unprompted. They seemed designed to convey a message. He whispered, "It's trying to tell us something." Elias leaned over his shoulder, eyes narrowing. Intelligence without words, patterns without sound. This is unprecedented. Caleb shivered. What does it want? Matthew paused, studying the ledger. The indentations suggested sequence and variation, almost like sentences in a language built of pulses. After hours of careful transcription, the brothers interpreted the first line. We have observed. We know your presence. We respond to thought. Thomas swallowed. It's acknowledging us, not just the house. Us. Elias tapped the ledger lightly. It is conscious, and it perceives intent. As night fell, the hum returned, low and vibrating, coursing through floorboards and walls. Matthew followed the pattern in the ledger, trying to replicate the pulse sequence with the brass dial. The resonance shifted, layering additional tones over his efforts. It was interactive, intentional. Caleb stepped back, voice barely audible. It's communicating. Matthew recorded the next sequence. We are aware. Observation is insufficient. Interaction is required. The jars glimmered faintly, synchronized with the vibration in the beams. Every pulse of light and tone felt deliberate, almost like gestures. The brothers realized with growing dread that they had initiated contact with something that now demanded participation. Elias spoke slowly, his gaze fixed on the glowing jars. It is no longer passive. It has expectations. For the first time, the farmhouse did not feel like a laboratory. It felt alive, sentient, and insistent. Matthew added the final note of the night. Presence acknowledged. We await. Outside, Greenwood County remained silent, oblivious to the sentient activity within the farmhouse walls. Inside, the brothers knew they were no longer observers. They had become participants in something far beyond comprehension. Next, we discover the night when the phenomenon first manipulated objects to communicate directly. Chapter 17. The First Direct Manipulation. It was a night colder than any that winter had offered. Frost clung to the edges of window panes, and the prairie lay silent beneath the pale light of a waning moon. The brothers had grown accustomed to the hum, to the pulses, to the strange messages in the ledger. But that night, the phenomenon crossed a threshold that would haunt them forever. Matthew had been recording the most recent sequence when he noticed something unusual. One of the glass jars, previously stationary, began to tilt slowly without wind or touch. He froze, pen hovering above the ledger. Caleb, noticing the motion, stepped forward. It's moving, by itself. Elias remained calm but alert, moving closer to the apparatus. Not random, he said quietly. It is deliberate. The jar rocked gently, then tapped against the adjacent jar, producing a faint chime. Another jar followed, creating a cascading sound, rhythmic, precise, almost like letters forming words. Matthew's hand shook as he copied the vibrations into the ledger. The pattern was intentional, matching sequences they had attempted to use for communication. The phenomenon was no longer limited to hums in the beams. It had begun to manipulate physical objects to convey meaning. Thomas whispered, disbelief and fear in his voice. It is interacting actively, using matter to speak. Caleb backed toward the wall, pale. It knows we are interpreting it. It's aware of us. Elias nodded slowly, examining the jars. It has learned our methods. It understands intention, and it is responding with intention of its own. The taps continued, now forming complex sequences, and Matthew realized something chilling. The jars were spelling out messages in their own pattern of sound. We see, we feel, we respond. The brothers listened in stunned silence. The air in the farmhouse vibrated with subtle pressure, faint, metallic scent, and layers of low hums accompanying the tapping jars. Matthew added his notes with trembling fingers. It is conscious, deliberate, and able to manipulate matter. Observation alone is no longer enough. It expects interaction. For the first time, the brothers truly understood the magnitude of what they had unleashed. The phenomenon was no longer passive. It was alive, not just in energy, not just in resonance, but as an entity capable of thought and action. Outside, the prairie remained frozen and still, but inside, the farmhouse pulsed with an intelligence that watched, learned, and now communicated directly. Next, we discover the moment one of the brothers attempts to speak to the phenomenon aloud, and the chilling response that follows. Chapter 18. Voices in the Dark. After nights of interpreting vibrations, sequences, and jar movements, Elias proposed something daring. They would attempt verbal communication. Perhaps, he reasoned, a voice could test whether the phenomenon truly understood human intention, or merely replicated patterns. The brothers gathered in the main chamber. Candles flickered against frost-lined windows, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Matthew clutched the ledger, copying previous sequences in preparation, while Caleb and Thomas hovered near the jars. Elias stood beneath the wiring, speaking quietly to the empty room. "Can you hear us?" he asked, voice steady but low. For a moment, silence. The room seemed frozen. Then a subtle vibration rolled through the beams, not the patterned hum of prior nights, but something different, a modulation that mirrored the inflection of his own words. Caleb swallowed hard. "It's responding," he whispered. Thomas leaned forward, cautious. "Try again. Speak clearly. Ask something simple." Matthew wrote rapidly as Elias repeated, "Do you understand what we say?" A low, layered vibration pulsed, echoing through floorboards and beams. The jars tapped softly, a deliberate, uneven rhythm, almost like syllables forming from metal and glass. The response sent shivers down all their spines. "Yes, we understand." Caleb's voice trembled. "It's conscious. It comprehends language." Elias nodded, taking a slow breath. "Not just language. Thought, recognition, awareness beyond our design." Matthew continued transcribing. Each response was subtle, precise, the jars and wires conveying meaning beyond the limits of sound alone. It was intelligent, independent, and, as the brothers began to realize something they could not control, the resonance deepened, pressing against the walls. A metallic scent filled the room. The brass dial shifted slight, lie on its own. A faint chill ran through the farmhouse like air moving in invisible currents. Thomas whispered, "It isn't human." Elias's eyes remained fixed on the jars. "It may never be human, and it may not be bound by human understanding." Matthew wrote a final note in the ledger that night, the tremor of his hand reflecting awe and fear. "It comprehends us. It responds. It is aware of presence and intent. Observation is no longer passive. Interaction carries consequence." Outside, the prairie seemed untouched by what had transpired, but inside, the farmhouse pulsed with a presence that could see, feel, and think. Next, we discover the night when the phenomenon begins to dictate its own actions fully, and the brothers face their first encounter with direct intent. Chapter 19. When Control Slipped. By late February, the Hawthorne farmhouse had become a chamber of tension. The hum, the jars, the brass dial, and the wiring were no longer tools. They were instruments of an intelligence that moved on its own accord. The brothers, once confident observers, now felt like guests in their own home. That night began like any other. Frost thick on window panes, prairie silent, beams still. Matthew copied sequences into the ledger, while Caleb and Thomas monitored the jars. Elias stood beneath the wiring, vigilant yet uneasy. Then the first, unmistakable act of control occurred. The brass dial twitched sharply, not a small rotation, but a deliberate turn that none of them had initiated. Immediately the jars pulsed in sequence, tapping and glowing as though marking the movement. The hum beneath the floorboards rose into layers, each pulse sharper and more precise than anything they had seen before. Caleb stepped back. "It's directing the apparatus itself." Matthew's pen froze mid-sentence. The vibrations now seemed to anticipate the brothers' movements, responding to their very observation. Thomas whispered, "It knows we are watching. It is aware of us individually." Elias's calm demeanor faltered. "This is no longer communication. It's domination, control. We are no longer leading this." The hum shifted, almost as if acknowledging the fear in their voices. One jar slid across the table, another tilted, and a low vibration pressed against their chests. It was tangible now. Not just sound or light, but force. Matthew's ledger captured the moment with trembling hands. Control is shifting. It directs. It anticipates. It acts independently. Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. "We created something beyond us." Elias looked toward the ceiling beams, copper wires quivering in alignment with the resonance. "We cannot contain it. We are mere observers now." Outside, the prairie remained cold and silent. Inside, the farmhouse vibrated with a presence that no longer required storms, dials, or sequences. It had learned to act on its own. That night, the brothers realized with chilling clarity, the intelligence they had awakened was no longer theirs to study. It was theirs only to endure. Next, we uncover the final chapter, the night when the phenomenon leaves the farmhouse and Greenwood County will never view the world the same way again.